Chapter 6. Crespi braced himself for the impact, eyes clenched shut, held onto the thick strut with all his strength. The weighted transport plummeted through the dark for a few impossibly long seconds, while all around he heard the screams of the creatures following them down. Bam! The impact dislocated his shoulder and slammed his head into the metal panelling hard enough to blur his vision even further. There was no time to do it gently. He jerked his arm out and up. His teeth grit against the pain as the bone and muscle popped back into place. Rocks and debris rained down from above, clattered in echo across the cave floor, joined only by bursts of static from the ruined ATV. The air was clearer here. Muffled shafts of light struggled through a crevice to his left. Something else struggled too, a half-crushed drone there in a pile of shattered rock. Crespi slid from the slanted roof of the battered ATV and aimed, squeezed, and watched as the alien's bizarre, twisted form exploded, bubbled into stillness. Another sound, behind him, soft in the ringing aftermath of the shots. Crespi spun, pointed. Sergeant Carl Gibbs crawled out from behind the transport, coughing, a gun in hand. He stood, stumbled over to Crespi. The look of fear seemed out of place on his strong features, the tension bunching in his huge shoulders. Gibbs, pumped iron, old style, had chatted with Crespi about it a few days before. Crespi shook his head at the random thoughts, unable to focus. This is impossible. Didn't happen, couldn't happen. They were Marines, for Christ's sake. For a moment they surveyed the wreckage all around them, the torn, hissing pieces of drone bodies, and the mostly unidentifiable remains of the Marines who had gone down with them. Crespi saw Wilcox, could only tell by the uniform. There was a thick slab of rock where his head should have been. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see Cady or Tom or any of them. Not like this. From somewhere out of the darkness beyond them, he heard a sound that his mind rejected, that he wanted to be an illusion more than he'd ever wanted anything. He checked the counter on his piece. 3 rounds. 3. Hissing. Talons on rocks. Fuck! Gibbs stumbled over to Wilcox's corpse and snatched the captain's gun out of his limp hand. Crespi looked around desperately, saw only rocks and death. From the useless transport came another buzz of static. The transmission lost through the layers of rock. ATV 103, come... What's... in there? Crespi ran to the crashed door of the vehicle, screamed towards the stuttering intercom. Code Red! They're coming! Get us out of here! Code Red! Gibbs shouted behind him. Crespi! He searched for a weapon. Nowhere. No time. Ran back to see Gibbs fire at the first drone. Another one behind it, taken down in a blast of fire and acid. A third. Crespi aimed carefully, felt no relief as his last 3 rounds shattered the shrieking monster. There were more coming, but they were farther behind. A few seconds, maybe the last few seconds of his life. The ATV's comm squawked amid the fading reverberations and the sounds of the drone pack moving closer. Not compromise the safety... Static. Out in the open. Over. Shit. They couldn't come in. They were fucked. Crespi, grenade left. He turned, saw Gibbs throw a 6-second thermal at the light-filled crack in the cavern wall. Crespi dropped his useless weapon as he scrambled over a pile of rocks to crouch behind the transport, Gibbs right behind him. A horrible scream behind them. Gibbs turned, fired at the metallic blackness that ran towards them. Whoom! A deafening explosion filled the cavern as the grenade blew, rocks and dust flying. The ATV rocked and swayed, settled. Crespi felt liquid trickle from one ear, from his nose, barely registered the sudden silence before Gibbs was pulling at him, jerking at his arm. They stumbled through the settling cloud of powdered rock, and then Gibbs was climbing and pulling him up. Come on! The barest whisper, though Gibbs must have shouted it. Oh God, daylight! A sudden, wistful hope filled his fogged brain. They were out, crawling through the jagged hole the grenade had left, halfway up a barren slope in a series of barren slopes. Crespi squinted down into the shadows, saw dark shapes moving towards them. Gibbs pushed him, hard, and they were both falling, rolling down the steep hill and away from the hole where the monsters dwelt. Crespi felt a rib break, then another, and he cried out. But at least there was light, At least they weren't in the cavern anymore. He slid to a stop, saw that Gibbs was near. The sergeant was pointing, shouting, "Come on, we can make it!" Crespi looked, saw what Gibbs was pointing at. The ship. The beautiful transport ship that would get them the fuck away from this nightmare. Run. They had to run. The ship wouldn't come any closer. Only a few 100 meters. They could make it. Crespi stood, looked back, and saw several glistening black shapes, no less frightening in the daylight, creeping out of the rip in the stone. They were coming. Gibbs saw what he was looking at and started to run, limping. Crespi took a few steps and then fell, got up and kept going in spite of the terrible pain. Ribs, shoulder, his entire body. Hell was behind them. He didn't look back, kept his bleary gaze on the ship in front of them. Gibbs was faster, in spite of the limp, but they both moved slow, too slow. The ship hovered, kicking up whirling clouds of dust far ahead. Crespi didn't hear it because of the ringing in his ears, but he knew, suddenly knew, something was right behind him, something much faster than him. A bolt of agonizing pain in his side as a giant dark claw grasped his broken ribs. He was spun around, vaguely aware that he screamed, but unable to hear the depths of terror in his own voice when he saw the thing that held him. A giant, seething animal, crowned with a massive gleaming comb of black. She had 2 pairs of arms, the ones that held him long and articulated with tight strips of dark matter, the talons sharp and piercing. Blood ran from the wounds in his chest, and he saw behind her another entrance to the hellish cavern. Her lair. For this monstrosity was surely the queen, half again as tall as her drone minions, hissing and screaming at him with no sound. She brought him closer, close enough to see the pearly spittle glisten across her steel teeth. The horrible jaws opened, impossibly wide, and he saw the second set extend, slowly, so slowly. Crespi struggled, screamed, his dusty boots kicking against her skull, but she was too strong, carried him to her dripping jaws with ease. He was going to die. "I'm sorry, sorry." Suddenly she jerked, screamed, and even through the ringing he could hear the bullets, see the splashes of bubbling blood that exploded from her back and pattered the dust beyond them. Her tremendous hands clenched, crushed him, and dropped him to the ground. She turned, shrieked in rage and hurt, and then fell, writhing, pulling herself away from him, back to her darkness. Miraculously, only a few tiny droplets of her obscene blood had hit him, splashing across his chest armor. Hands clutched at him, unbuckled the hissing chest plate and threw it aside. Gibbs. "You all right?" He was being pulled again, and he let out a strangled sob. He was alive, hurting, but alive. "No." Gibbs slung Crespi's arm over his shoulder and limped on, grunting with each shuffling step. "We gotta get in the clear so they'll open the lock. We're gonna make it. Hold on." It seemed an eternity of rocks and dust beneath their feet, and Crespi could hear the sound of the ship's air compressors getting louder. But behind them, the shrieks of the creatures also increased in volume. Gibbs kept talking, mumbling words of encouragement. Crespi realized that he was in shock, for in spite of the planetoid's desert temperature, he was shaking with cold. It was Gibbs's laughter that finally made him look up. In front of them, not 5 meters, the drop lock of the transport ship, lowered within their reach. Gibbs let go for the barest second, hoisted himself up onto the gridded platform, and then reached back for Crespi. The large man lifted him easily and pushed him ahead, over the waist-high railing and into the lock. Crespi still shook, but he managed to smile in return to Gibbs' wide grin, reaching back with numb arms to help. The ship lifted, up and away, the desert rock dwindling beneath them at incredible speed. God, they were safe. They had made it, alive. And Crespi began to laugh as Gibbs grinned, the truth of it in his eyes. And then the grin opened wider, the eyes suddenly bulging from their sockets. Gibbs screamed, his thick fingers clutching convulsively through the wire, skin cracking. "No!" A dark metal rod, red and slick, tipped with gnashing teeth, shot out from Gibbs' open mouth. His cracked skull elongated, ripped in half, spewed Crespi with warm, quivering flesh and blood. The sergeant reached forward with one dying hand, a last instinct to save himself, and fell away. The alien still enmeshed in his body, its inner jaws clicking wetly through the back of his skull. He tumbled down in a cloud of his own gore, into the teeming nest of black drones far below that hissed and shrieked their fury to the skies. Crespi fell to his knees, the hot wind whispering past his tortured ears, fell to his side, curled into a ball of aches and wounds, and finally he slept.